Thank you, Leah. Thank you, David and Irene. So, hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here today, and I'm going to talk about my PhD project and its findings. So, the slide you can see up there is Disablist Hate Crime, Acts and Misconstructions, and hopefully that'll make a bit more sense as I go through. So, if I just introduce myself, and I noticed that someone in one of the previous ones said, had said that they were a second career researcher, and I think I'm a third career person. So I am a learning disability nurse by trade. Then I had a police officer sandwich, where I went and did a short stint in the police, and then I went back to nursing before becoming a lecturer. And I've been a lecturer now for a long time, but I've only recently finished my PhD. And I'm interested, as you can see there, in social justice, disabled hate crime, obviously, and also institutional abuse. And the why question, I guess, why did I do this? I did, obviously, I've worked with people with learning disabilities for a long, long time. And I did a master's in research, and I did a small project with people with learning disabilities talking about their experiences of abuse and violence and harassment. And it grew out of there, really. And I wanted it to be about people with learning disabilities, but it became much bigger, and it became about disabled people. I wanted it to be about perpetrators, and it ended up being slightly different as PhDs go. So my final aim was to better understand disabled hate crime and how the actors within the criminal and social justice system can best respond. And those are my research questions there. I was interested in the acts, the context, and so what was happening, because that seemed important, the nature of the relationships between offenders and victims, and the response of the actors in constructing incidents as disabled hate crime. So today's session, I'm going to focus on my research findings, talk quickly about the context and methods, and then my three main areas of findings were the acts of perpetrators, and from that a perpetrator typology is being developed, the context of the acts in terms of the process of targeting, and the responses of the criminal justice actors in terms of how they construct disabled hate crime and how they construct vulnerability. So just a little bit of framing, because I imagine a lot of people on the call will understand what hate crime is and disabled hate crime. And because I've recently moved to Scotland, I should have said that at the beginning, I guess. I was working in Salford, and now I'm working at Edinburgh Napier. So in Scotland, there's quite a different lens in terms of it's more focused on prejudice than on hostility. And there are stirring up offences in Scotland. And the new Hate Crime Act seems to have kick-started reports of disabled hate crime again. And I know you've got someone coming in a few weeks of you to talk about the Scottish perspective. But we know that there's a hierarchy of hate crimes, and Mason Bish referred to this in 2014, where learning disability was at the bottom in terms of the types of offences that could be recorded. Obviously now there are a lot of transgender hate crimes as well, so I think transgender and disability are unfortunately battling for which is the kind of Cinderella of hate crime. But I think it's really important that we focus on it and we look at hate crime and disability and how that impacts on people. In the context when I was doing my PhD, obviously as a nurse, I'm well aware of the murder of disabled people as part of what happened under Hitler's regime and Action T4, and the abuse scandals in the 60s and 70s in hospitals. The paradigm shift to community care didn't make things a lot better for disabled people. And the context at the time I was doing my PhD was there was a flurry of investigative reports and disability activists raising the profile of what was happening for disabled people. So you can see there we've got Getting Away with Murder, we've got Catherine Quarmby's book on why we are failing disabled people, the EHRC inquiry into disability-related harassment, and then more recently the Leicester Hate Crime Project, and particularly how that focused on disabled hate crime. And more recently still, Getting Away with Murder, 2020. And the message that seems to be coming out of these documents was the nature of crimes and the lack of hostility, so to speak, confusion around vulnerability, the dependent nature of disabled people's lives. This was what's coming out of the literature. Perpetrators were often friends, institutional discrimination, and the need to involve disabled people in looking at disablist hate crime. So you usually start with what is the scale of the problem, and for disability hate crime, this is one really big problem because we don't know what the true picture is. Police records, 13,777 reported to the police. That's thought to be the tip of the iceberg. Potentially more accurate figures from the Crime Survey for England and Wales, it's more like 50,000. But again, that's thought to be the tip of the iceberg because people don't report for a number of reasons. And then when they do report hate crimes, they're not taken forward and prosecuted as such. So there's a dark figure between those that are experienced by people, how many are reported, and there's frustration at how many are actually prosecuted. 6%, 1%, figures very low. A change in Scotland, particularly this last year, is that disability aggravated charges have increased by 22% to 903, which is the highest number of charges since this legislation came into force. And there's an upward trend. And also in Scotland, there are figures now that I think it's 3/4 of these sorts of crimes are reported by people with learning disability, and 15% are people with physical disabilities. So moving on to my research, I used grounded theory. So it was a continuous process of reflection and data collection and data analysis. But broadly, you could split it into 3 phases. So the first phase was collecting data from the police. And this was records of hate crimes and hate incidents, but it was also other crimes because I needed to broaden it out, and I needed to widen my hate incidents field as well because there were 3 hate crimes reported in the year that were prosecuted, so I had to find other ways of getting at the police data, but they were very helpful with me. I included, because I was doing grounded theory, I included field notes, discussions with police officers, interviews with police officers, my reflexive diary, conceptual maps, and the use of memos. And I identified a lot of gaps in these cases compared to what we knew already, particularly in terms of care facilities, carers and family members as perpetrators. So I moved on to phase 2, where I interviewed safeguarding practitioners, exploring the crimes and safeguarding incidents that not necessarily have been reported to the police, where safeguarding and social workers were taking the lead. And I also spoke to interviewed some students in a focus group about cultures in health and social care facilities. And from that, I had my basic categories, but I moved on to sample more for the 3rd category, which I call brutalisation. So I did theoretical sampling of cases that were in the public domain. And that involved serious case reviews and independent office of police conduct reports. And as you can see there from my little table, altogether I had 100 cases, 44 police cases, 3 disabled hate crimes, actual prosecutions, 24 hate incidents, and 17 other crimes, which covered the scope of crimes that we knew were happening but weren't evident in the hate reported crimes. 41 safeguarding crimes and 15 in the public domain. So if I look now at my findings, first of all, this is just an overview of what my findings were. So I break that down into 3 separate areas. So the acts of hate crime that I was seeing in the data split it broadly into 3 categories of intimidation, exploitation, and brutalisation. But these are mutually exclusive, as I'll talk about, and often intimidation and exploitation go along together and will end up in brutalisation if that's not interrupted. And from the acts, we're developing a perpetrator typology, and I'm working on that now with Jane Tyson for a chapter in Irene and Sempi and John Garland's book. I'll talk more later about that. Also, I've identified a process of disabled hate crime, and I looked quite closely at the constructions, as I said, by the police and other people involved in the criminal justice system. So in terms of acts, almost half of the acts I looked at are the cases, I don't like the word cases, but the incidents that were happening to people were intimidation. And although this has no representative value, it just was the biggest area for me in my data. And I separated these into two categories, two subcategories. So there were the incidents that happen, I call them discrete incidents, where they're just an isolated incidental act, and I had 14 of those, and 35 were a series of repeated incidents, which I call structural intimidation. The discrete incidents were written or verbal abuse and threats. Perpetrators here were strangers, neighbours, or unknown to the person, to the victim. These were usually close to a person's home. And overall, a third of these perpetrators were women. If you look more closely at the data, you can see that although the perpetrators in general of intimidation were women, if you dig deep, you can see that perpetrators of discrete incidents were more likely to be single men acting alone or in public, and the women were more likely to be involved in the structural intimidation. In the structural intimidation, most were repeated incidents of verbal abuse, property damage, threats of physical violence and harassment. Most were face-to-face, lasting months or years. Some were carried out by groups, some by individuals. Some of these individuals were in an intimate relationship with the victim, as we know, don't we? And these repeated incidents happened more in the private domain than in the public domain, so in a person's home or a care facility. And in 4 of the cases, there was the people were cohabiting or they were in a relationship with each other, which was also a relationship of coercive control. So the perpetrators of structural women were more likely to be women acting alone, as I've said. Where we knew the ages, 28 perpetrators of these, I was aware of the ages because they weren't all recorded on the police data. Over half were over 40 years of age. So if I move now on to a couple of examples of this. So Joe is one example of discrete intimidation, a man 45 years old, autistic, with learning disabilities, and he was faced down the street by 5 lads, 13 years old, 2 on push bikes. It happened just outside his house for about 5 minutes, and they were calling him names, including the word spacker, and then ended up chasing him. This was recorded as a hate incident. He was terrified by this, but it's a one-off incident, no further action taken by the police. The second case, to show how different intimidation can be, is a structural intimidation, and you've probably heard of Bijan Ibrahimi, who lived in Bristol, had a mild learning disability and other physical disabilities, and slurred speech. He was Iranian with what's described as a thick accent. There were several offenders who were targeting Bijan, but 2 murdered Bijan. And I should say that some of these cases are distressing, and I'm sure you're aware of that, but just as a warning to you. The intimidation of Bijan happened for years, and he made 85 reported records to the police that we know of. There were threats to kill, setting fire to his house and his car, verbal abuse, damage to his property, assaulted with a car, bitten by a dog, allegations of him being a paedophile and sexual assault. Once he was accused of being a paedophile, agencies got together and moved him away from where he was to a different house, but his reputation followed him, not helped by the attitudes of the police. Initially, the police were sympathetic, but that did change over time. And they gave him unsound advice. So, for instance, he had a reputation of being moved because he was a paedophile. Children where he moved to were destroying his flowers. He reported it to the police, who said, well, we need some evidence, take some photographs. And you can imagine what that did in the local area to his reputation. He became seen as a problem and as a pest. When his flat was set alight and he was moved, MAPA got involved in multi-agency protection, but nothing seemed to help him. These incidents continued to happen. And the report into his death, he was beaten to death by 2 men and his body was set on fire. And the report into his death and the police actions said that one of the policemen, PC Duffett, was part of a reservoir of negative attitudes towards Mr. Ibrahimi. And these attitudes were passed on to others, and that may have contributed directly to his murder. The second category are exploitative acts. And these involve people intimidating victims to get access to their assets, money, property, labour and sex. Almost all of these, 38 cases, were in private spaces. Again, 2 categories, discrete and structural, 15 discrete cases. Only 4 were financial, 11 were sexual exploitation, and by that I mean rape. 2 of the cases of financial exploitation were strangers, 1 at someone's home, 1 outside on the street or in a care facility. 2 were distraction burglaries. The subcategory of sexual exploitation, almost all of these involve verbal coercion and physical violence. All the perpetrators knew the victim. 5 were friends in terms of perpetrators, 4 were nurses or carers, 1 was a podiatrist, and 2 by people sharing the same living space. Most happened in the person's home or care facility, as I've said, but 1 did happen on the street. In terms of, so they were only discrete cases because the police seemed to take those seriously and investigate them. In terms of structural exploitation, which happened over weeks, months and years, 22 were financial, so it's a different split, with only 1 case of repeated sexual exploitation. In terms of the perpetrators of the financial exploitation, all the perpetrators were known to the victim. 11 were family members, 5 were carers. There were 4 cases in this data that the police did refer to as hate crimes. And I don't want to go into too much detail on that, but that's a label that's been developed for disabled people, people with learning disabilities and mental health, as a way of understanding what's happening. And it's a highly contested term. GNAS and others claim it's unhelpful and misleading. And it didn't fit in with my data. The people in my data were not vulnerable. They were made vulnerable by perpetrators and by the situation, which I'll talk more about later. In contrast to the case of intimidation, most perpetrators were men, largely because all the perpetrators of sexual exploitation were men. Most were over 18, half were over 40. In cases of sex exploitation, again, most were men, 3/4 were over 40. And in the discrete events, most perpetrators know the victim as a friend or a neighbour, a family member or a carer. So many perpetrators are in positions of power and trust here and have manoeuvred into a fake friendship using grooming, which I'll talk about later. And a couple of examples here. This is David Askew, a case that you probably know. David was targeted, initially targeted and intimidated, but also exploited. And you can see how the 2 run alongside each other here. So David was 64. He and his brother had learning disabilities, lived with their elderly mother. Moved to Manchester and began to be targeted. This went on for 40 years. On the street outside his home, in the local shopping centre, included antisocial behaviour, throwing tomatoes, eggs, stones, asking for money and cigarettes. David was assaulted several times, and some people entered the family home and simulated sex with David. So again, there's this like deviant sex thing being put onto David that wasn't true. David would bite his hand when he became frustrated, and he became a figure of fun. There was again a multi-agency response which didn't have any impact at all, and David died in his front garden after a group of young lads had tipped one of his bins onto the floor and he ran out. He died of a heart issue, but he did face years of harassment. And I'm not criticising the police here because they did try. They did try to help him, and they did go in and they helped him paint his house and they helped support him, but it didn't stop what was happening to him. And the second case is the only case I have of structural sexual exploitation. And the reason I want to highlight this is because this was a young man who was 22, who was groomed by a neighbour. And he was taken to the football and he was assaulted in the car every time he was taken to the football. And he turned to drink in order to deal with what was going on for him. And he would get drunk and then he would go into town and report this to the police. The police would then take him to the station, wait for him to sober up. And then he didn't want to report it because he'd sobered up and he was scared of what was going to happen to him. And they took him back to his house and said to his mother, in front of his mother, if he doesn't stop this, we're going to arrest him for wasting police time. He only ever approaches us when he's drunk. So the attitude of the police was, again, less than helpful and didn't stop what was going on. The third category is the extreme end of subjugating and dehumanizing that goes on in the intimidation and the exploitation, and it's often related to the final stage of exploitation. I had 13 cases. 3 people were sexually assaulted and raped, 6 people were murdered. Many cases combined exploitation with emotional, sexual, verbal, and physical acts of violence. And again, in here, there was some that the police were calling mate crimes, and they're not mate crimes, they're brutalization. The incidents took place within the victims or the perpetrator's home, but they were also spilling out into other areas like social clubs. These are cases that involved a long process, which resembles the process of cuckooing, Spicer discussed. I analysed 9 cases of cuckooing, 4 by a single person, 5 by a group. But the property wasn't used for drugs. The main motivation was to exploit the victim for sexual services or labour, or to get access to their property. So it fits in more with Spicer's interpretation of cuckooing as a nascent crime model. A different picture of perpetrators here. They're single males or all male groups. Very rarely females are involved in a mixed group, but no single females. But again, older people aged 30 to 65. I did have one younger group. But again, many of the perpetrators knew the victims as friends, family members or partners. And a case I just highlighted, Kerry, a female, 27, who lived independently in a housing association flat. She had learning disabilities. She was engaged to her boyfriend. She went to the day centre. She had care support staff. She had a great life. She was befriended by a couple at a disability disco over several months, and they groomed her and they used coercive control to steal all her money and her assets. They isolated her from her carer, parents, boyfriend, stole everything in the apartment, and then moved her into their home. She was being raped by the male. They moved her into their home, which was across county lines. I was told this case by one of the social workers, who was very frustrated because there was no actual crime, that the young woman wouldn't report what was happening to the police. She was working with the young woman and then they whisked her away, and she lost contact with her because she did go across county lines, but in a different way to what we know of it. And another case of brutalisation is one that I found in the police data, and then also safeguarding practitioners told me about it, and then also Nazir Afzal wrote about it in his book. It took me a while to work out that this was the same case. This person was called Child or Adult A, and it happened quite close to where I was doing my data collection. And it's a case of what we would call modern slavery over 9 years. So as a child, Anna was brought to the UK by her uncle and her aunt. She was deaf and didn't have any speech and didn't understand English. And she was locked in the cellar. And that there is a picture going down to the cellar that she was kept in. And she was forced to work as a cleaner and a cook for the family and to make items which they sold illegally. They stole her benefits, but also she was raped and physically and sexually assaulted by several members of the family, her uncle and her aunt and her cousins. She was rescued by trading standards officers with the support of the police, and they did some great work with her in terms of teaching her sign language so that she could talk about what had happened to her. And they did prosecute not for hate crime, but they did prosecute the perpetrators and they got sent to prison. So it was good police work after the event. This is just a quick summary slide of my perpetrators of disabled hate crime, just to show that very rarely are they strangers or local youth. More often they're partners, friends, neighbours, and medical social professionals. So, so now if I focus on, because I was doing grounded theory, I constructed a theoretical explanation of the data, and this focuses on what I call the dynamic process of disabled hate crime, which is a process of dehumanising and othering the disabled person. So firstly, the perpetrator defines the targeted person as other, as different, not me, and often uses disabled terms to refer to the person. So there were words like cripple and retard. There were also negative stereotypes, which I think is important: dirty, smelly, fat, lazy, ridiculous, paedophile, sexually deviant, as we've seen, dishonest. Also, people are portrayed as being vulnerable prey, and I know that's a problem in terms of framing people as vulnerable, but but the perpetrators seem to latch onto this, defining them as being vulnerable, as did the police. They may know the person as well, so they could also know about their situational vulnerability, which I'll talk about in a minute. And so they see them as a target for exploitation and brutalisation. In the targeting phase, this is direct subjugation with dominating acts over the disabled person. For example, demanding the disabled person's parking space can happen in public and in private. It involves often manipulating relationships, using grooming, gaslighting, coercive control, and power to either exploit existing relationships or develop new ones. So people were moving from being a carer to being a friend, in inverted commas, or being a neighbour to being a carer to being a friend. And when they're in that position, then they're in a better place to intimidate and exploit. And these could be, as I said, carers, neighbours, and family members. The targeted person in the final part reacts, and you can see how this goes backwards and forwards. By pushing back, very few people pushed back and tried to assert their authority, if they had any, or tried to stop what was happening, tended to make things worse. People seek help from the police, social services advocates, again, often ended up in the situation getting worse for people. And some people endured the abuse and what was happening, particularly if they valued the relationship and the cost of what was happening wasn't as great as the loss of the relationship. Throughout this process, as you can see, there's a dehumanising act, and the dangers of this really need recognising, because they might seem innocuous, but they can lead to brutality and death. And the case of Brent Martin is a good example of this, where he was being intimidated and exploited. He was seen as different, vulnerable, and a target. And he was having his money taken from some 3 men in particular where he lived. Brent had learning disabilities, and he was recently out of a psychiatric inpatient unit, and he came out with quite a bit of money. All that was taken in loans to these so-called friends. When they were down to his last £5, they had a competition to see who could knock him unconscious to win his last £5. As he lay dying, they urinated on him and posted photographs. And when he was arrested, one said, "I'm not going down for Muppet," which is a term of abuse. People with learning disabilities and mental health needs wasn't portrayed as a hate crime. But you can see how first they were taking his money, and it moved on to quite brutal acts in the end. And then the final part of my findings was how the police and I'm just checking the time. How the police and other actors construct disablist hate crime. And this wasn't going to be an original aim of my research, but it became evident throughout my analysis that it was an issue. So as you can see, I've split the slide into 2 sections: how it should go on the left, and how it often does go. And how it should go looks fairly straightforward. So we have a report of a crime or an incident. We should be gaining, interpreting initial information, identifying disability and vulnerability. That was what the police were supposed to do in order to identify it as a disabled hate crime. Then they gather information, investigate the report, get to the bottom of what's going on, build a case, look for evidence of disabled hate. Then they move on to following up. So it's allocated, if it's been recognised as there may be some disabled targeting there, allocated to an inspector, completing investigations, referring on to victim support. And then the final actions, tying up the case, submitting the file for prosecution and advice of the CPS, and requesting a sentence uplift. Unfortunately, that didn't happen in any of the cases that I looked at. And what did happen, and I don't know if this is me being a police officer and having contact with a lot of police officers, but I saw some alternative constructions that were made by the police, and I would like to get into this a bit more with the police up in Scotland. But it seemed to be from the case files that the police would say, "Oh, well, this isn't our job." So if it was a microaggression, antisocial behaviour, or it could be seen as a neighbourhood dispute or trouble with youth, then that wasn't something that we would be investigating as a disabled hate crime. The second kind of misconstruction was if it was what they called an inside job. So when they would be identifying it as abuse or domestic violence, if it was happening in the home, between partners, in families, or as in the case of Winterbourne View, where it's inside a care facility. And that might be police officers' internalised disablism. It might be just that they're very busy and they're prioritising what they do, but they didn't seem to want to get involved in those things. And the safeguarding practitioners weren't blameless either. They would often say, "Oh, well, it's just care and stress," no matter how bad it seemed to get. And the third alternative construction was positioning the disabled person as a difficult person, not as an ideal victim. So the case in point there is Bijan is a really good example of that. PC Duffy decided that he was the problem. And he actually went to the police station on the night he was murdered, asking for help because he was so desperate and didn't know what to do. And he was so scared for his life, and they sent him away. And Christie talks about the ideal victim as being vulnerable, blameless, small, versus the big bad perpetrator. But sometimes some people with learning disabilities or mental health needs might not fit this ideal perpetrator image. And they may have unusual behaviour. They may not be, in inverted commas, blameless, so it may be an ongoing dispute. But the police very rarely take a trauma response to this. They position the person as other, as in child sexual exploitation cases. We've seen that as well. And then I just wanted to talk about the issue of vulnerability and whether we should be looking at vulnerability in terms of a layers model rather than an intrinsic vulnerability of a disabled person. There are criticisms about the discourse of vulnerability in the hate crime field, and it is problematic. Chakrabarti and Garland, say that it should be central to hate crime, but this is resisted, and Ralston and others have said that it blames the victim and ignores the structural and contextual aspects of what's happening. And that was certainly the case in my analysis. And as MacDonald and others have said, it can shift the focus away from the hate element to the vulnerability of the victim, which is then problematic for sentencing. And ultimately, the risk is then that we don't take a rights-based response, we take a protectionist response. And this did seem to underpin many of the police and safeguarding practitioners' understanding of what was happening to disabled people and their responses to that. So I thought it was useful here to look at a layered model of vulnerability. I have since gone to been at a big event last week with the police and some practitioners from Australia, and one of those practitioners was talking about maybe adding another layer at the bottom. We are all vulnerable because we're human beings, so we're all vulnerable to start off with, but recognising within that vulnerability for disabled people is underpinned by the structural ableism, which impacts on our lives and which makes people more vulnerable to disabled targeting. So when the disabled person then, with all this going on, is then put in a situation where they have few protective factors, where they're socially isolated, where they don't have social capital and legitimate power, then their vulnerability increases. And then the individual factors seem to come into play, particularly in my data, and compound what's already there for disabled people. So if we think about Bijan and the rhetoric around Bijan and the intersectional nature of the situation, he's Iranian, he was an immigrant, he was poor, he didn't work, he's placed in social housing, potentially internalised ableism and racism in the police and the housing, labelling it as a past. He had no power to choose where to live. He didn't have family and friends close by to offer help. He didn't have that protective layer. He was in a tough community. And then his own impairments and behaviour added fuel to the fire in terms of the understanding of the people that he was asking for help. And he had little social capital there. So in conclusion, I'd just like to recap and highlight some areas that I think are important. I think that if we start conceptualising the acts as intimidation, exploitation and brutalisation, it might help the police to see what's going on. And it's useful then that we can see that different perpetrators do different things, and there's different typologies. And hopefully the perpetrator typology that I'm working on with Jane will develop. Jane's got a lot of data involving disabled people, which I see is missing from my data, so hopefully that will be a stronger typology. recognising the dehumanising process of coercion involved in intimidation, exploitation and brutalisation. I'm hoping that that can offer a framework for the police to recognise what's going on, and if they can see the coercive behaviour, the manipulation, the dehumanising and the language and the stereotypes and the misuse of power in this structured action of hate crime, if they can recognise this process, then they can identify the repeated nature of these acts and hopefully interrupt them earlier on. Some people don't present as the ideal victim, and a trauma-informed approach is essential here. We need to recognise the humanness of each individual and recognise that disabled people as humans first. I think it's helpful to consider the layers of vulnerability when you're looking at multi-agency working, because the systems seem to make things worse for people quite a lot of the time. But I did have some examples of brilliant, curious, determined officers and safeguarding practitioners who probed situations deeper, were curious, and managed to stop what was happening. And finally, we're all responsible for stopping disabled hate crime. And in Scotland, they're looking very much at a public health community approach. And I think this might be very useful moving forwards. There you go. Oh, hang on. That's the end of my presentation.